Welcome to the deep dive.
Hey there. Today we're diving into a stack of sources, research, historical documents, recent articles, all focused on the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Situated right at that crossroads, isn't it? Asia, Africa, Europe. It might seem small on the map, but, well, our mission here is to unpack all this material and show you a history that's anything but small.
Exactly. We want to understand how this land, an ancient cradle of civilization, has navigated, millennia of empires, conflicts, huge challenges to become the Jordan we see today.
And why should this deep dive matter to you?
Well, Jordan's location, its history, they've kept it absolutely central to regional and international events. And its ongoing challenges, they really reflect broader issues playing out across the entire Middle East.
It's a place of incredible resilience. You really see that in the sources.
Okay, let's dive in then. So maybe we should start with just laying the groundwork, the geography, the earliest history. Where exactly is Jordan? Right. Officially, it's the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. That name itself is significant, tying the modern state back to the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad, which connects to its legitimacy and, well, its whole narrative.
Okay.
Location-wise, it's bordered by Syria up north, Iraq to the northeast, Saudi Arabia east and south. It touches the Red Sea way down south at Aqaba, and then shares that long border with Palestine and Israel to the west.
And it's not huge, is it? I read somewhere it's about the size of Indiana, somewhere between, 89,000 and 96,000 square kilometers.
That's right, yeah, depending on the specific measurement. And the capital, Amman, that's home to around 4 million people now, but the geography inside those borders, it's actually incredibly diverse.
You really get everything. That vast eastern desert plateau, western mountains, these dramatic rift valleys, the Jordan Valley, which is famously fertile but has, the world's smallest river.
And the Dead Sea, of course, the lowest point on Earth, largest salt lake, and that vital little outlet to the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba.
Population-wise, mainly Sunni Muslim.
About 92%, yeah, but ethnically quite diverse. But what really struck us from the sources isn't just the current picture. It's the sheer depth of its history. We're talking sites dating back to the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras.
Paleolithic. Wow. So it wasn't just near a cradle of civilization. It really is one, despite, being in a region just constantly shaped by conflict.
Exactly. This land saw kingdom after kingdom rise and fall. The Moabians, Edomians, Nabataeans, Ammonites, Gassanids, then the big empires, Romans, Byzantines, various Islamic caliphates, and finally the Ottoman Turks.
And you found a point in the sources about early environmental awareness. That seems quite modern.
Yeah, it was interesting. Despite being a very arid region, Jordan was apparently the first Middle Eastern country to set up a nationwide environment department back in 1976. And they enacted environmental laws pretty quickly after that.
A small detail, but maybe telling. Okay, so digging into that ancient history, the Iron and Bronze Ages, you mentioned kingdoms like Edom, Ammon.
Right, Edom down south. Ammon sort of between the Zarqa River and Wadi Mujib Canyon. Right. And Rabbath Ammon, ancient Ammon, was a capital for different groups over time.
But the real stars of the ancient period, according to the sources, seem to be the Nabataeans.
Oh, absolutely. They started out probably as this confederation of caravan traders, absolute masters of the desert routes.
And they managed to turn that skill into a pretty formidable kingdom, right? Especially around the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, under rulers like Aridus IV.
Yeah, and their capital, Petra, it's legendary. The sources call it their ideal capital, naturally defended, fortified, just this stunning site with buildings carved straight into those sandstone cliffs.
Little rose-red city, half as old as time. Everyone knows it.
But what's really fascinating about the Nabataeans, it's not just the stunning architecture, it's their ingenuity. Especially with water. They were masters of hydraulic engineering in a bone-dry environment. Thousands of rock-cut cisterns, clever devices to capture every drop of rain.
And some of those systems actually lasted centuries.
Into the 20th century, yeah. Incredible foresight. And they adapted. When northern trade routes got disrupted, maybe by Roman expansion or something.
They didn't just fade away.
No, they pivoted, developed new routes south, across the desert, down to Red Sea ports like Elath and Lutecombe. And that strategic shift, for a time, made Petra incredibly wealthy. One source even called it the richest city in the world. They also controlled the ancient road of kings for moving agricultural goods.
Truly resourceful people. There was another Nabataean city mentioned, Oisbe, or Basra.
Yeah, Basra, north of Petra, also grew large, supported by agriculture from oases, again using clever water systems. It thrived until the Persian Empire came along around the 4th century BC, and that's when the Nabataean kingdom started to decline.
Setting the stage for the Romans.
The Romans. They formally annexed the whole Nabataean kingdom in 106 AD after a military campaign.
Was the conquest really destructive for the area itself?
Surprisingly, the sources suggest the land wasn't heavily damaged initially. Maybe its remoteness helped, plus the relative peace of the early Roman Empire. Some Nabataean traditions, particularly among the aristocracy, actually continued. Roman influence was more about integration,
Right.
building temples, baths, adding classical Roman touches to existing structures.
But it wasn't all good news under Roman rule. There was a downside.
Oh, definitely. The sources are quite clear on this. Heavy taxes became a major burden, led to famine, scarcity. People were forced off their land. Famous sites like Petra's royal dining hall were just abandoned, filled up with sand.
Wow.
Yeah. Trade routes the Nabataeans had built fell into disuse. Towns declined, temples were neglected, some towns were even mortgaged off to cover taxes. Brigands appeared on the roads.
It really drives home that quote you found. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Losing that autonomy came at a steep price.
Absolutely. So after the Romans, we get the Byzantines. They ruled for about 6 centuries, from the early 4th up to the late 7th century AD.
And what defined that period for this region?
It was a time of massive change, socially, politically, religiously. The Byzantine Empire itself was under constant pressure on its borders. Goths, Huns in Europe, the Sassanid Persians to the east, and crucially, the emerging Arab tribes from the south. All this pressure led to fragmentation within the empire.
And this is the context for the rise of Islam, right? How did Byzantine rule end here?
It ended with the emergence of powerful Arab kingdoms in the late 6th, early 7th centuries. That transition had huge repercussions, political, economic, cultural. The existing Christian populations and other ethnic groups had to figure out how to deal with this new reality. Some accommodated, some resisted.
Did the Byzantines leave a strong urban mark?
The sources suggest maybe less so here than in other parts of the empire. The sort of Hellenistic Roman urban tradition seemed weaker. But archaeology does show evidence of Byzantine urban centers, churches, material culture. Temples were converted into churches. It wasn't, a complete abandonment.
Okay, so into the 7th century, the Islamic conquests. How did that play out in this specific territory?
Well, the sources actually debate the speed of conversion to Islam. Some suggest it was surprisingly fast for some groups, maybe just a generation. Others argue it was much more gradual, like over a century or two, which implies a large local Christian population continued for quite some time.
So not necessarily an overnight change everywhere. Where did early Islamic settlements pop up?
Places like Petra, Madaba, Amman saw continued use or new settlement. And villages sprang up along the old Roman road, the Via Nova Trajana, that main north-south route or near essential water sources.
And archaeology in central Transjordan has been key for this period.
Yes, definitely. It's revealed a lot about settlement during the Umayyad period, cities, palaces, roadside inns, or way stations.
Yeah.
Sites like Amman, Jarash, Hizban, al-Rasas, they show evidence of early Islamic urban life and, importantly, signs of cultural exchange between Muslims and Christians.
But there's still uncertainty about the rural areas.
Exactly. The assumption is often that rural communities stayed predominantly Christian for longer. But archaeology relies more heavily on textual sources for the countryside, and piecing together that complex interplay, the day-to-day transition between Christian and Islamic life, is just trickier than in the big centers.
And those Arab Christian Ghassanid tribes you mentioned earlier, they converted over time.
That's what the sources indicate, yeah. This whole period also marks the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate, a massive new power.
Right. Based out of Damascus initially. Huge empire.
Absolutely huge. Their armies swept across the Levant, Syria, Egypt, North Africa really quickly. By the 640s, by the 660s, Arabic was being established as an official language. Eventually, their rule stretched from the Atlantic coast all the way to western India.
But the sources also highlight a lot of internal conflict and controversy during the Umayyad era.
Oh, definitely. There was significant hostility after Caliph Uthman's assassination, leading to civil wars.
Yeah.
Key figures like Ali and his sons Hassan and Hussein were assassinated. Hussein's murder at Karbala by Yazid Firoz's agents being particularly infamous.
And there were accusations leveled against some of the rulers themselves.
Yes, the sources record accusations, things like drunkenness, excessive lifestyles, immoral behavior, wasting state wealth, cowardice, greed, plundering conquered wealth. Now, the sources are careful. They say these were accusations perhaps made more serious by the crimes of a few rulers. But Despite all this internal turmoil, the Umayyad period saw a massive Arab expansion, and Jordan's territory became part of this vast administration.
Okay, jumping forward quite a bit now, the 12th century brings the Crusades.
Right, another tumultuous period. European knights, heavily armed, using superior military tech for the time, managed to capture Jerusalem and establish Crusader kingdoms, mostly centered in Palestine.
How did that impact the land east of the Jordan River? What would become Jordan?
A lot of that territory remained largely under local control, outside the main Crusader strongholds. Areas like Gilead, Perea. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem tried setting up Christian settlements, but they faced constant attacks. The southern part was under tribal control. The north remained under Arab tribes who'd been there for ages.
Did the Crusaders build much on the East Bank?
They did conquer some areas and build things, yeah. New structures in existing towns like Macab, Heshbon. They built fortresses to protect settlements, like at Adra. So it looked like Crusaders were settling the East Bank to some extent.
But it wasn't a deep or lasting presence?
Doesn't seem like it. The sources suggest the castles were probably too isolated to really encourage large-scale relocation or farming. They weren't building full-on garrison towns. By the end of the 12th century, significant parts of the eastern Jordan Valley and nearby areas were actually deserted.
Okay, so after the Crusaders, we eventually get to the last great empire to rule the region before the modern era, the Ottomans.
Starting around 1517 for this area. The Ottoman Turks, they were the last big wave of conquests from the Asian steppes, building this massive Islamic empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna down to the Holy Land by the 14th century.
Ruling most of the Islamic Middle East, except Iran and parts of Arabia, for nearly 500 years. How did they govern?
They were pretty pragmatic, actually. They even kept some institutions from the Byzantine Empire they conquered, like aspects of a centrally managed peasant economy and a kind of secular state administration, alongside the religious structures. They governed through local officials and managed the diverse population by dealing with communities through their own religious leaders.
And they had a military advantage.
Yeah, especially with artillery. Their architecture was also really interesting, very cosmopolitan, blending Byzantine, Moorish, even Italian styles.
But this huge empire eventually weakened.
Started losing territory in the 19th century, especially to European powers. By the early 20th century, it was often seen as lagging behind the sick man of Europe, before collapsing after World War I.
And the area of modern Jordan was known as Transjordan under Ottoman rule. What was that like?
Well, when the Ottomans took over from the Mamluks in 1517, they also inherited the title of Caliph of Islam. Transjordan became part of the empire and didn't face major outside challenges until European influence really picked up in the 19th century.
How was it administered day to day?
They divided lands into provinces and districts, though the boundaries changed a lot. Transjordan was part of a relatively stable province for a long time, and from about 1520 to 1831, things were fairly quiet, relatively speaking. The Ottomans relied heavily on local administrative elites. The sources called them notables to keep things running.
Until that changed.
Yeah, that system got disrupted when Egypt tried to annex Syria and Transjordan in 1831. The British helped the Ottomans push the Egyptians out by 1840, but afterwards the Ottomans clamped down hard on those local notables, sometimes quite brutally.
So more direct Ottoman control after that.
Exactly. They reorganized things, creating smaller districts in the mid-1860s for better control. From the 1870s, there were reforms aimed at making administration more modern and efficient. They also changed how they dealt with non-Muslim groups. The Jewish community gained autonomy, and Christian communities got extensive privileges after 1860, particularly in administration, education, and legal matters. Printing even started to flourish in some regional cities.
What about everyday life, the economy under the Ottomans?
The sources paint a picture of life being largely comfortable, stable, kind of static for many, with a sense of homogeneity. But at the same time, modern ideas and trends were starting to penetrate. New social classes emerged. Some people rose in wealth and status, becoming new elites, while others were displaced or became impoverished. It's described as the populace becoming more urbanized, maybe, rather than traditionally civilized, adopting modern concepts and tech, but unevenly.
This long Ottoman period really sets the stage for modern Jordan's birth, which is tied so closely to the Arab Revolt in 1916.
Absolutely pivotal moment. That revolt was driven by rising Arab nationalism pushing back against Ottoman rule, especially the Young Turk policies that emphasized Turkish identity over others. And it was also part of that broader regional desire for independence from European colonial ambitions, too.
Key figures being Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his son Faisal.
That's right. Faisal needed allies against the Ottomans. A crucial letter was sent in January 1915 to Sharif Hussein, basically promising Allied support for an Arab uprising in return for an independent Arab state covering the Hijaz, Syria, but not Lebanon and Iraq, parts of Arabia.
And the sources make a point about what was not included in that promise.
Yes, critically, the sources state that this proposed Arab state did not include Palestine. So, with that promise of Allied backing, Faisal launched the revolt, armed by the Allies, famously capturing Aqaba and disrupting the vital Hijaz railway.
Now, here's a really interesting and quite controversial point from the sources. They suggest that to specifically undermine Faisal's vision of a large Arab state, British representatives actively persuaded Zionist leaders to support establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine.
The purpose stated in the sources was pretty explicit: to drive a wedge between Arab and Jewish aspirations in the region and prevent them from possibly collaborating.
Wow. Okay, so after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and we enter the British Mandate period, a time of, well, instability. The Allies met in 1920 to decide the fate of these former Ottoman lands.
And this is where Transjordan as we know it starts to take shape. Emir Abdullah, another son of Sharif Hussein, entered the area, kind of exploiting the uncertainty. He managed to persuade the British to make him Governor General, a role he held for about 10 years.
The 1921 Treaty of Transjordan formalized this, but the sources mention parts, like the Eastern Desert and Jerash, were initially under direct British control.
Correct. They were incorporated a bit later, around 1925. The main territory allocated to Emir Abdullah contained, the bulk of the population at the time.
And political life started under the Mandate, first elections in 1923?
Yeah, but it was a tense time.
Yeah.
Partly because of rivalries within the Hashemite family itself. Abdullah's father and brother were consolidating power elsewhere. The British Director of Arab Affairs suggested making a concession to growing nationalist feelings.
And that concession was the sort of hybrid election.
Exactly. A simple ballot, but only half the assembly members were elected, the other half appointed by the emir. The British saw it as a way to gauge public opinion and get political groups interested. Initially, parties focused mostly on local stuff.
But it did spark something more organized.
Yes, the sources show an organized opposition started to emerge. Despite their own divisions, nationalist groups actually united during that election and won over half the elected seats, showed the potential for mobilization.
Eventually, the Mandate period came to an end,
British troops pulled out in April 1946.
leading to full independence. May 25, 1946, became the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, later just Jordan. Abdullah I became king, recognized internationally.
A constitution followed in 1947 meant to set up a parliamentary system, but the sources say it wasn't really put into full effect immediately because laws needed parliament's approval, and parliament wasn't convened right away.
And this new kingdom, as one source puts it, was born under a pan-Arab cloud.
Definitely. The huge issue dominating the region was the future of Palestine. The Arab League rejected the UN partition plan. Then, on May 15, 1948, the day after Israel declared independence, Arab states urged intervention. Lebanon, Syria, Egypt mobilized their forces.
But Jordan's situation was a bit different, the sources note.
Yeah. Despite having British logistical support, the sources state Jordan didn't get significant material or moral aid from the other Arab states at that critical moment.
And King Abdullah I, he had his own ambitions regarding the territory.
He'd been trying to get Arab states to push for a better deal than the UN plan offered, though mostly unsuccessfully. He got vague promises of support for his kind of greater Syria dream, but not much concrete.
Looking at the politics after independence, the sources mention quite a bit of tension, even death threats later against King Abdullah I's grandson for being pro-Western.
And the presence of Islamic extremist groups operating within Jordan, sometimes linked to al-Qaeda, even from behind bars back in the 1990s.
A threat that tragically became reality with the 2005 hotel bombings in Amman.
A horrific attack by a local terrorist group on a hotel wedding, killing 60 people. A real shock to the system.
King Abdullah II was abroad but flew back immediately. His response was notable, wasn't it? Calm, emphasizing the danger of extremism, the need for interfaith respect.
Yeah, the sources suggest the event really underscored the need to support nonviolent moderates, maybe people who'd been overlooked before. Jordan's always lived in this incredibly volatile neighborhood, constantly fearing instability spilling over.
The late 50s saw political changes in Egypt and Syria. Then in 1970, Palestinian guerrillas operating from Jordan launched raids into Israel, which led to that harsh crackdown by the Jordanian army, Black September.
Politics in Jordan have often been described as volatile, ambiguous. Religion's role in public life has also grown, and while there have been moves toward democracy and economic liberalization, sometimes those changes have ended up solidifying a new elite without bringing the deeper political reforms some felt were needed.
King Abdullah II, on the throne since 1999, he's faced a mountain of challenges, political, economic, social. His approach defines the current era.
The whole post-9/11 period, the War on Terror, that was huge for Jordan's stability. And those 2005 bombings were a direct challenge to the king's legitimacy, to the state itself.
But the sources also suggest Jordan's strategic importance gives the king some room to maneuver, policy-wise.
It's always a balancing act, and the sources are really clear. A huge part of the country's challenges, historically and now, comes from the immense burden of hosting over 3 million Palestinian refugees and having a population where Palestinians are actually the majority. That's a massive factor for the king.
The government structure is a parliamentary monarchy, but power is still quite concentrated.
Yes, very much so, among the royal family and key Bedouin tribal elites. King Abdullah II has spoken about the need for gradual political reforms to maintain stability, especially seeing the rise of Islamist movements after the Cold War ended.
He's promised things like constitutional reviews, national dialogues on elections, party laws, government accountability, especially as demands for reform from within Jordan have grown louder.
Right, and you have organized opposition like the National Front for Reform presenting their own agendas. The sources kind of weigh the possibilities. Gradual reforms might stabilize things, but just empowering security forces, even with Western help, could actually increase public grievances while maybe not improving perceived security. There's a warning there. Without real, timely political reforms, the potential for serious trouble remains.
Let's really delve into those intertwined issues. Conflict and refugees. They seem absolutely core to understanding Jordan. The 1948 war, Israel's creation, the Palestinian exodus.
The sources describe that exodus with words like harshness and casual brutality, arson, looting, mass shootings. They say it struck right at the heart of Palestinian identity.
And being violently expelled, it wasn't like a gradual migration. It shattered hopes of an easy return.
Exactly. And that memory, that trauma, has been kept alive for decades. Refugees in camps and cities hold on to material objects, stories, collective memory. Rural Palestinians, the sources say, can still point out traces of their former villages, old walls, grain silos.
That 1948 war fundamentally changed Transjordan itself. It was much smaller before, population and size-wise.
Right. During the fighting, the Arab Legion, Jordan's army, occupied large areas, including much of Jerusalem's Arab quarter, parts of what became Tel Aviv Jaffa.
And the sources are explicit. Transjordan gained demographically and economically from this forced displacement.
Yes. Palestinians came to make up half the population in the areas Jordan took over, which is about 2/3 of the land. Jordan gained cities, resources on the West Bank, and aimed to formally annex them. They also benefited, strategically, by not settling in the UN-designated demilitarized zones, sort of basking in Israel's shadow, as one source puts it.
So some benefits, like a more educated elite emerging infrastructure investment.
Correct, but huge downsides too. King Abdullah strongly supported Palestinian guerrillas, hoped for an Arab state there. Israel saw this as a major threat. The tension boiled over. Jordan's premier and army chief were assassinated in July 1951. Just 6 weeks later, King Abdullah himself was assassinated.
And the sources suggest this pushed Jordan into a complex position, seeking Israeli help, but also getting drawn into Nasser's pan-Arab anti-Western movement. A very difficult balancing act.
Extremely difficult.
Yeah.
The 1948 war itself, the sources detail it starting as fighting between Arab and Jewish groups as the British left. The UN partition plan, accepted by Jewish leaders, rejected by Palestinian Arabs fearing displacement.
Things escalated fast.
Very fast. By December 47, intense fighting, bombings, especially in Jerusalem. Specific incidents are mentioned. Attacks on banks, post offices, kibbutzim. Haganah air activity was bad news for the Arabs.
UN mediation didn't stop it.
No. Palestinian groups fought back, got arms from cities, Transjordan, Iraq, Yemen. Bombs were prepared, shelling from Al-Quds Hill, checkpoints attacked, a Tel Aviv synagogue bombed, the CID building hit, killings increased on both sides.
Then the Haganah changed tactics.
Decided on immediate, coordinated attacks on stronger Arab settlements. This led to places like Haifa falling to Jewish forces.
And chaos elsewhere as people fled.
Right. Tel Aviv braced for reprisals. Arabs fled, advancing Jewish tanks. Disturbing details emerged from the sources' cemeteries dug up near Jerusalem's Old City, presumably to gain entry. Arabic names erased.
The Old City itself came under siege.
Negotiations failed. Haganah forces took the entrances, attacked Arab quarters. The sources mention a massacre at a Muslim cemetery, hundreds killed, including women, children, describe gulling nights of terror, frontal attacks, heavy casualties.
It's a truly brutal picture painted by those sources. Okay, moving forward to the 1967 war.
Yeah, late 66, early 67, Arab militant activity against Israel, especially from Syria, was ramping up bombings, attacks.
Yep.
Israel felt its ability to deter these was failing and started serious war preparations.
Israel's alliances, particularly with the U.S., were pretty clear. Their military was positioned against Syria, Egypt, and Jordan.
And the sources note Jordan was seen as sort of drifting towards closer ties with America's Arab adversaries at that point.
June 5th, 1967, 7:15 a.m. Jordanian forces were expecting an attack based on intelligence.
And by 8:30 a.m., Israeli air activity started. The impact was immediate and devastating for Jordan. Within hours, most of its air force was destroyed, along with critical communications links to the front lines.
Other Arab nations did react: Iraqi planes, Egyptian ground forces, Libyan planes.
But for Jordan, it was already catastrophic. Without air cover or observation planes, their armored divisions on the Golan Heights stood no chance against Israeli air power. They were forced into a retreat. The Syrian army also suffered massive losses.
On the Egyptian front, Israel advanced towards Suez. What was King Hussein thinking?
Seeing the powerful Israeli army massing on the West Bank, knowing his own armor would be annihilated in the first hour without air support, attacking was just too risky. After some sporadic fighting on June 6th and 7th, King Hussein ordered a complete ceasefire.
The sources also mention an Israeli gross miscalculation.
Yes, they suggest Israel underestimated Syria's commitment initially, sending forces against Syria and opening a second front unnecessarily. This mistake, the sources speculate, might explain some surprisingly cordial early interactions between Jordan and Israel after the war, even calling Israel unrepentant.
This long history of conflict leads eventually to peace efforts. The 1974 Cairo summit declared the Palestinian cause the #1 issue for Arab nationalism.
And then came that absolutely shocking announcement recorded in the sources, Jordan being designated as the Palestinian homeland. A Jordanian minister was quoted live on air saying, "The Jordanian National Front rejects claims of Jordan as an alternative homeland. Jordan is Palestine, and Palestine is Jordan."
That's an incredibly loaded statement, reflects such deep complexities.
Totally changed the game. The sources then outlined 3 main policies that emerged regarding the conflict. First, the Jordan-Palestine relationship was framed politically as an occupation, while sociologically, Jordanians were seen as this mix of Arabs and Palestinians.
Second, the two states for two nations idea became the suggested solution.
Right. With Jordan potentially demilitarized, limited sovereignty under Arab League supervision, and Israel getting recognition from Jordan as the homeland of the Jewish people.
And third, direct talks with Israel were basically put on hold, leaving it to the Palestinians via abstention by other Arab states.
The Saudis especially wanted to wait for a better time to talk about the price of peace. Jordan's special relationship with the U.S., the sources say, initially led to hopes for peace at no cost. But the real sticking point became what price the U.S. would demand. Palestinians saw their dispersal as illogical, but Jordan's specific concerns often got sidelined by the push for broader Arab unity.
This era also included the tragic events of Black September in 1970.
A huge crisis for the Arab world. Jordan survived it, but faced immense pressure. It felt it could potentially face an opposing alliance: Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, the Palestinian left. The alternative was aligning with the Saudi-Egyptian plans to separate Palestinian revolutionaries from the general population.
The constant fear was refugees being forced to resettle permanently in Jordan.
Absolutely. And King Hussein firmly rejected that. According to the sources, he didn't want Jordan becoming a second Palestine. Then the 1973 oil crisis added another layer of regional conflict and shifting alliances.
So, bringing all this history forward, where does Jordan stand today, according to the sources?
It's described as a kingdom, parliamentary system, constitutional monarchy under King Abdullah II. And despite all the regional turmoil, it's managed remarkable stability, relatively speaking, for nearly a century.
The 2011 Arab Spring did reach Jordan, though.
Yes, there were protests, but the impact initially was limited, led mostly to what the sources call cosmetic reforms. Real deep change has been slow, often held back by economic pressures, especially those worsened by the Syrian civil war next door.
King Abdullah II announced an economic modernization vision in late 2021, aiming for more private sector involvement.
That's the plan, yeah. But the sources really questioned whether these initiatives will lead to meaningful, sustainable reform or if something more drastic might be needed.
What are the biggest internal pressures the government is dealing with?
Widespread corruption is mentioned frequently. Also, a kind of general malaise that set in after the first Gulf War. You see bottom-up protests demanding rights, better economic conditions, action on corruption, though the sources note these are often shut down by security forces.
And Jordan's relationship with Israel remains unique.
It's the second Arab state after Egypt with a full peace treaty, the only other neighbor with one, but that treaty is still unpopular at home. Rising public anger, often linked to events in the West Bank and Gaza, has led the monarchy to crack down more on street protests critical of the regime recently.
How stable is the actual state structure, the monarchy, the military?
The sources actually rate Jordan pretty highly on statehood and regime durability since '46.
Yeah.
The legitimacy of the royal family, the military, the intelligence services, they've weathered the Arab Spring, the Syrian war spillover. For now, grievances seem to be managed mostly through rhetoric, not spilling onto the streets in a massive way.
It is a functioning parliamentary system.
Yes, there's a parliament with some oversight. A prime minister leads the cabinet, appointed by the king. Elections happen, though many candidates recently have had state ties. It fits that classic Westphalian state model. Recognized borders, sovereign power, security forces, institutions.
How does Jordan navigate its international relations today?
Its borders, largely drawn by Britain after WWI, haven't changed much. Its history means its population is partly made up of people displaced from neighbors. Ideologically, it's been aligned with Western interests since World War II. Internally, the sources mention repressive measures against activists, especially regarding the West Bank, which they say help preserve its traditional character towns, farming, administration.
And concerns about Israel are still a major factor.
Huge factor. Sources mention Israeli concerns about Jordan's popularity compared to the U.S. in the region. Israeli leaders have hinted that if the U.S. doesn't provide strong enough guarantees, Jordan might lean towards Iran. Jordan needs, the sources argue, substantial aid and security guarantees in any regional deals to protect its own interests.
What about the U.S. relationship specifically?
Amman's expectations for U.S. security guarantees haven't always been met, especially when U.S. focus shifted under Trump. Jordan needs space to chart its own course, securing its core interests, including maintaining a nation-state balance with the Syrian axis, as one source puts it. Look, the UK and US have clear interests in Jordan. Order, stability, Israeli security. Ongoing security cooperation, support against Iranian influence, Jordan's role regarding Syria, all give it a global importance beyond its actual size.
Economic challenges just seem like a constant thread in Jordan's story.
They are enormous and deeply rooted. Key factors: heavy reliance on foreign aid, the constant massive influx of refugees over decades, regional instability, and a fundamental lack of natural resources like oil. Any major economic changes almost always depend on outside funding and implementation,
Development plans have always needed external help.
which makes the economy incredibly vulnerable. Wars, oil price shocks, aid drying up, they cause huge imbalances, inflation, deficits, falling living standards. There's a dramatic example from 1988. Relations with Iraq soured, grants stopped, forcing drastic measures, tax hikes, floating the currency, job freezes, privatization.
And the situation after the 2003 Iraq War made things even harder.
Yeah, it shifted the whole regional map, left Jordan feeling more isolated. Other countries became warier about aid. More economic shocks followed. GDP shrank. Inflation shot up again, hit 23% in the mid-90s. Banks lost hard currency. Exports collapsed. Government revenue plummeted. Widespread anxiety.
Sources mention a fuel price hike in '89 causing sharp rises in basics.
Yes, Parliament even tried to step in and cancel some price laws, but inflation just kept climbing. The sources use stark language, saying the middle class started to evaporate.
And the current economic picture still looks tough.
Yet the economy hasn't bounced back to that historical 6–8% growth trend. Big worries about government borrowing levels. Modeling the interaction between the real economy and the financial sector is tricky and likely to get harder. That commodity price boom in the mid-2000s, probably a one-off.
The refugee crisis is just inseparable from modern Jordan.
It's known worldwide as a refugee host, but the sheer scale and the nuances often get lost. You have these distinct waves. 1948 Palestinians, 1967 Palestinians, 1991 Kuwait returnees, 2003 Iraqis, and then the massive Syrian wave since 2011. Each one has left a profound mark on Jordan's population, politics, foreign relations.
The Syrian crisis really tested Jordan's traditional open-door approach.
Absolutely. Brought huge global attention. Hundreds of thousands flooding across the border needing everything: shelter, medicine, food. The sources stress that the Jordanian government and people feel a strong sense of obligation under international law, acting on humanitarian grounds despite their own severe financial strains.
Is there a sense of national unity in facing this?
Yes. The sources mention a strong sense of security and national unity among Jordanians, a feeling that everyone has to pull together to handle this huge demographic and geopolitical shift. They reiterate, Jordan's small demographics and geography matter immensely for stability. Preventing the Syrian war from expanding, becoming another endless conflict like Iraq, is crucial. International cooperation is key.
Beyond the conflicts and economics, the sources also flagged environmental issues.
Significant ones, yes. Overgrazing sheep and goats mostly causing erosion, desertification, land being lost to industry and transport. And critically, in the Jordan Valley, over-irrigation for agriculture is making the soil increasingly salty.
Which harms native plants and wildlife.
Exactly. Terrestrial biodiversity suffers. Endemic plants are hit hardest by the salinity. The government has programs, but the sources suggest they need to be more comprehensive, more integrated.
Any potential solutions highlighted?
Family farms are mentioned as having real potential for things like desert restoration. But they face big hurdles. Lack of secure land tenure for the people working the land, not much interest from traditional authorities, and low involvement from civil society groups, CSOs.
But CSOs are trying to make headway.
Yeah, there are initiatives trying to tackle these issues, trying to convince the government and funders about the potential of family farms. The keys seem to be building collaborative efforts, tackling that land tenure problem, getting influential figures involved, proper monitoring, and using national and regional networks for support.
So we've journeyed from Jordan's incredibly deep ancient past through countless empires, devastating conflicts, colonial mandates, right into the very complex present day.
And what really stands out from this dive into the sources, I think, is this thread of incredible resilience. Jordan holds this unique, often precarious position as a crossroads, somehow managing time and again to be an island of stability in an incredibly volatile neighborhood.
We've seen how its geography, that long, long history, and the conflicts that constantly swirl around it have just profoundly shaped everything: its identity, its economy, its politics, even who makes up its population, especially with the immense ongoing burden and complexity of hosting wave after wave of refugees.
Yeah, the material really shows a country that's gone through amazing transformations, but still faces these huge ongoing challenges. The economic struggles, the social tensions, the constant pressure for political reform, those environmental worries we just touched on.
It's a place where, ancient history feels very present alongside these urgent modern pressures, where tradition is constantly rubbing up against rapid urbanization, and where international alliances are absolutely vital but navigate incredibly tricky geopolitical waters.
So, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over after hearing all this. Given Jordan's long history of navigating upheaval and its current reality, that blend of heart-won stability mixed with undeniable internal pressures, can it successfully implement the kind of deep, sustainable reforms it seems to need to secure its future? Or will the sheer weight of regional conflict and those domestic challenges ultimately prove too much, even for this incredibly resilient kingdom?
It's a question that really feels like it's hanging in the balance, right there at that historic crossroads.